So to begin, where should I start? Okay, to begin, a minimum wage is not a great policy. It's not really a fantastic policy, simply because it raises the cost of production. So you think about it like this, right? A firm, the majority of firms are primarily profit driven, where they're just trying to maximize the profits. Total revenue minus total cost equals profits. So when you implement a minimum wage where the base salary increases, firms are now forced to pay more for their workers. So what does this result in? It results in the total cost of production increasing, and if you assume that the total revenue is constant, but the total cost increases, it actually results in a fall in profit, which would which would deter, firms from setting up shop in Singapore and setting up their headquarters here. This results in twofold issue. One being some companies will choose to take their production overseas, take the production overseas where to surrounding nations in Southeast Asia such as Malaysia, Philippines, Cambodia, where the cost of production is lower and where they believe the profit margins can increase. So this results in the loss of Singapore's competitive edge in the global stage, where jobs just flow out of the nation. This in turn will result in retrenchment and rising unemployment rate among Singaporeans in Singapore, which can only be seen as a negative as social stability falls. People become more agitated, more depressed, have greater levels of anxiety and stress, resulting overall rise in pessimism among Singaporeans as unemployment rates would increase. In addition, to make this issue worse, right, other than just companies taking their jobs overseas, there will also be an increased supply of workers as if the government announces that the minimum wage has been raised, say to $15, a massive increase, to where it used to be, where some jobs used to pay, there'll be a massive supply of workers. Many Singaporeans will be eager to work because the income has risen so much. So there'll be an increase in supply of workers, but a fall in availability of jobs as jobs go overseas, as firms take it overseas. This just results in a massive difference between the supply and demand for laborers in Singapore, which ultimately would just be horrible, as I illustrated earlier. So now another reason why a minimum wage is certainly not fantastic would be, let me think. Well, okay. Another reason why a minimum wage would not be fantastic, right, is that a minimum wage typically helps out those in low-income sectors such as cleaning and security services. By implementation of minimum wage in these sectors, right, it will simply just force firms and force companies in these industries to automate. So, if companies in these industries automate, example, for cleaning, for laundry services, right, just use a laundry machine. Security services, just put a lot of CCTV cameras and bulletproof glass. Some sort of idea like that. Now the need, for workers, for security guards, for individuals to work at laundromats, were full. So now with the loss of demand, for these workers, and yet a minimum wage for workers in said industry, what happens? It just simply results in rising unemployment rates specifically to that industry, such as I mentioned, the cleaning and security industry. This ultimately results in the supposed or aimed benefits of minimum wage becoming redundant, as while there is a higher salary and there's potential for low-income individuals to earn said income, they will be unemployed because they lost their jobs and were replaced by, as I said, bulletproof glass, by CCTV cameras. So what's the point? Ultimately, it will be the low-income individuals who lose out. So this in turn will result in these unemployed individuals attempting to find jobs in similar jobs within the same industry. So imagine a security guard loses his job in one firm, he tries to find employment in another company, but that company as well is also affected by the minimum wage law, so they too will implement CCTV cameras and bulletproof glass. So ultimately, there will be no more security jobs available. This results in structural unemployment, where the demand for skills, there's a mismatch between the demand for skills by employers and the possessed skills by employees. These individuals would then have to go back to school, to learn new skills, to be able to make themselves employable in a new industry, which would just put more financial strain on said family, which is already likely a low-income family. Another reason why I would say the demand why minimum wage is not a great policy would be that the fact that the demand for workers who earn low wages is actually price elastic. So what does this mean? What does this elasticity concept even mean? Basically, what it means, right, when I say price elastic for workers in low income industries, is that an increase in the wage for these low income workers, there's a more than proportional fall in quantity demanded of workers. So what I'm saying is, like as I mentioned earlier, right, when your implementation of minimum wage, it results in some low income workers losing their jobs. But since the demand for workers in low income jobs is actually price elastic, the result of an increase in wage results in more than proportionate. That means a more massive fall in quantity demanded for laborers in low income jobs. The reason for this, right, is that jobs which would typically benefit from minimum wage, more often than not, belong to the low income jobs, low income skills, which can easily be substituted, by machinery and automation. So hence, many low income workers, many low skilled laborers will be forced to take on a secondary or secondary part time job, or even maybe 3 jobs, to help make ends meet. So ultimately, this will result in increased stress levels, increased anxiety, worry, just burning them out and lowering the quality of life, really, as they have no leisure time. They will just be working as slaves. And simply because the number of hours that their original job was willing to employ them has fallen. Because, well, they're slowly being replaced by machinery. So now, guys, my back. Sorry. Now, guys, that I've covered, a vast variety of viewpoints on the pros and cons of a minimum wage, I think I'll give a bit more on my personal thoughts, an evaluation with specific relation to Singapore about the minimum wage policy. So I would like to highlight one point, right, that I see many individuals who are proponents, who postulate that the minimum wage is a fantastic idea, say. While it's true that for many developed nations, around the world, like Australia, right, where they've implemented the minimum wage, well, it can be argued that it's working out. However, in Singapore, right, there's the assumption that the higher costs that are incurred due to a minimum wage, where the cost of production increase, so producers just raise the price of their final good so as to make up the difference, so that the increase in costs can be offset by the increase in revenue, so that their profits is maintained. Right, that assumption, right, that the higher cost in the final good can simply be taken care of, simply be overcome by Singaporeans because they now have high incomes due to minimum wage. It's not really true exactly in Singapore's context. While Singapore does have a strong economy, while more workers will be able to afford, the high priced goods because of a rise in minimum wage, doesn't really apply to Singapore because the majority of Singapore's economy is not driven by consumer expenditure. It's actually driven by exports. So with Singapore being highly dependent, on exports and on competitive trade, by implementation of minimum wage, which will in turn result in increased price of the final good, would actually reduce Singapore's competitiveness on the global stage in terms of their export import, because our goods would be now more expensive relative to prior to the minimum wage for foreigners. So for foreigners, our goods will now be seen as more expensive. Their ability to purchase our goods would fall. The demand for our goods and services would also fall, which ultimately results in a fall in our exports, which, assuming that our import levels are constant, would actually result in a fall in our net exports, which in turn affects our economy, reducing our economic growth, which ultimately will result in fall in income levels and employment levels. So that's all, guys. Thank you for checking out my video on minimum wage. I think I'll split it up into 2 parts. because it's a rather long video now. I think 23 minutes already. So I'll put into a part 1, part 2 for greater ease for our audience. If there's any questions in the comments, right, hit me down below. Drop those comments below if you have any questions regarding my points, anything you'd like to add, maybe I can take into consideration. If you think you can, even maybe change my mind, because currently I'm more against the minimum wage than I am for it. If you think you can change my mind, drop it down below and let me know what you think. Before you head off, hit that like button and subscribe to see more content like this on a variety of social issues that affect us in Singapore. This is the end of this episode of Chit Chat with Joshua. Good night and goodbye.